様だ。
貴様よりどのぐらいザワールドのスタンドパワーが強いかちょいと試してみたか。ザワールド。
待て、なぜだ。
死ねい。
What would you do if you were magically transported into a different world? Let's actually think about this logically. Not everyone is suited to go to a different world and fight a demon king, so what would you realistically do? Would you try to fight and save the world with the fear of dying constantly in the back of your mind? Would you play a supporting role and just be there to help out the hero of that world defeat the evil? Or would you go around and explore that world in more ways than one and experience all this mystical realm has to offer? I feel like a couple years ago, the choice would be obvious. Who wouldn't want to band together with some other adventurers and save the realm? That's probably because it's all we were ever exposed to when it comes to these fantasy stories. You have these reviewers always throwing around words like world building, but what did that really mean? Yeah, it's nice to have a well thought out world that's interesting, but the setting never played too big of a role and was just kinda in the background. That was until the show came along and asked, what if, hear me out, what if, instead of going on crazy adventures and killing the monsters and beasts of the world, you had sex with them? Mind-blowing, really asking the hard-hitting questions and pushing this machine that is innovation forward in the anime industry. Joking aside, it's honestly a really good question not asked by its predecessors. Maybe not the sex part, but the idea of what if you actually lived in a world like this? How would it function? What are the politics? Literally asking the viewer, what if our society, instead of being built off of technology, was built off of magic, and we weren't the only top dog species? All of this and much more being shown in a show that's literally Sex Review. Before I get into how this show stands above others like it, such as Konosuba and the practice of parodying their own genre, it's important I give a brief rundown of the characters and plot. Ishizoku reviewers, also known as interspecies reviewers, follows our main trio of characters. Stunk, a human adventurer with an interesting past you learn nothing about. Zell, an elf archer, also Stunk's friend, who is 200 years old and has been on plenty of adventures you don't hear about. And Krim, an angel whose halo broke and no longer can use their powers or get back to a heaven that you learn nothing about. As well as a myriad of other interesting and well-developed characters as they go from town to town, country to country, brothel to brothel, reviewing Suck You Girls. We'll get back to the whole you learn nothing about parts later. You follow along their crazy escapades as they end up in different scenarios, going into different brothels. After doing their business, they review that place along with the girls in it and post it to the adventure board in the tavern they loiter around, while others gather around and read their review. That's pretty much it. The premise is basically like a YouTube video on YouTube. Go somewhere, do something, or buy something, and then review it and upload it for others to see and discuss. It's literally that simple of a premise. A premise that could get old really fast if that was the only thing the show focused on. But luckily, this show's world is so fleshed out that even when the episode is just going to a brothel to review it, it's still so interesting as you learn so much about that world, even details you don't think you needed to think about, like where would non-fire resistant species go to eat in the volcano lands. On top of that, you have these characters that I can't even describe just how fun it is to watch them interact with each other. Watching Krim go from this pure angel to becoming a fellow degenerate is one of the saddest, yet most hilarious things that happens throughout the show. I think, in part, a reason why it's so fun to listen to them bounce off of each other is because of their voice actors. You can really tell the voice actors have a lot of fun recording each and every episode. Just listen to them talk about them recording the opening.
すごい収録も楽しかったな。
収録楽しかったです。
まあまあまあ確かに。
僕真島さんの次に収録して真島さんのを聞かせてもらったんですけど、あ、真島さん楽しそう。俺も楽しい。
すげえ言われんだよ。
でも私 私も一番最後だったんですけど、二人すごく楽しそうでしたって言われて。
You can honestly feel the camaraderie between everyone, as it actually feels like a group of friends just having fun, dicking around. Speaking of that opening, I think that alone was enough indication of what you're actually getting yourself into. My favorite part being Nu Ko'oze, which has a couple of translations to English. My favorite being, let's bust a nut. For God's sakes, it sounds like the fucking YMCA. Don't even get me started on that bop of an ending. With all that out of the way, let's actually get into why this show stands out among its peers. I'll break this up into 3 categories: parody, satire, and subversion. These 3 concepts can seem interchangeable, as they kinda have a close definition and people usually throw them around liberally, not knowing the differences. Think of these concepts like squares to rectangles. All squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. A subversion can be parody, but not all parody is subversion. A parody is an imitation of a style that is exaggerated for a comical effect. Satire is a use of comedy to poke fun or criticize people's or societal views on certain topics. And finally, subversion is the contradicting of ideas established by a larger society. For example, a teacher yelling at students for being out of dress code, only to reveal that the teacher himself is out of dress code. I don't think I need to explain how that's subversion. I'm sure everyone understands the differences between the 3, so let's start with parody. I think it being a parody is the easiest of the 3 concepts to grasp, but also the hardest to relate it to since it's played pretty straight. Instead of ending up in some world where the hero tries to save it from a demon lord, we follow a band of heroes as they try to save the world from bad brothels. Oh yeah, and the demon lord is a giant lolly. The entire time, though, it's played somewhat straight, and the show doesn't pause to insult the audience's intelligence by being like, "Ha? See? Get it? It's like that one thing, but not!" So if we look at it from a removed perspective, it still does act as a parody to the whole isekai fantasy genre by following a pretty likable cast of characters, but they're likable not for their heroics, but for their perverted tastes, following a loose story outline of an isekai or fantasy story while exaggerating the elements involved, all the while playing it so straight that you can't help and look at it like, okay, it's funny and I know they're joking, but they're being so serious about it that I can't tell if I think it's funny because of how they're making fun of different shows, or it's funny because it's such a crazy concept and they're playing it completely straight like it's normal. Think of it like Poe's Law. It's impossible to make parody so exaggerated that people won't mistake your parody for you being sincere about the topic. You can easily look at the show like, yes, this is 100% all it is, reviewing the women in the brothels they go to, each episode objectifying them. But the whole concept and execution is so clearly exaggerated, so it's inevitable that some people will get hung up on certain aspects that don't necessarily come off as exaggerated as other parts, and therefore conclude that the whole show is not parody, because these parts are exaggerated to a point where they don't seem obvious. So, in short, yes, it's a parody, but it's exaggerated to a point where some people will get lost and look at it as it being deadpan serious. Now let's move on to satire, which this will be a little bit more controversial for some, but just remember, the purpose of the show is to entertain at the end of the day by taking the piss out of different concepts for comedic effect. Okay, now that I said that, this show was actually surprisingly deeper than I would have thought from a surface level. Since the show follows a cast of reviewers, we see many legit points that often get brought up and discussed when talking about the validity of reviewers. Our main cast just gives their brutally honest opinion about both the establishment and the girls. This builds a reputation as just honest people, and they're not oblivious to this fact, and neither are the characters around them. This is shown through the demon's brothel they visit at the end of the show. During the beginning of the season, after building their reputation, they're approached by the demon party's PR person, asking them to give their opinion about the demon brothel, in order to help improve the demon's perception in the public eye. They don't immediately do so, as they get distracted by a more important matter. Anyway, after visiting the demon brothel, they learn about the demon girls and understand why they're perceived so badly by the public. They have a fetish for contracts. Don't worry about it. And since some people are giving them badly worded contracts that the demons will follow to a T, they end up with a bad reputation. I'll let the demon chick explain.
君を幸せにしてみせるよ。結婚してください。
なんて言葉でプロポーズしちゃうと、ほらさっさと幸せにしろよと言わんばかりの命令するだけのぐうたら嫁になります。
ひでえな。
ですがプロポーズの言葉を
結婚して二人で幸せになろう。
に変えるだけで、同じ悪魔でも夫をしっかり支える良妻へ大変身。
本当かよ。
So, in a weird way, the literal sex reviewers have more credibility and are the only people who can help improve how people perceive these demons due to their reputation the reviewers built by just being brutally honest with how they feel about whatever they're reviewing and not catering to certain people or sugarcoating it. So after explaining to their readers that the demons are just misunderstood, it starts to slowly improve the reputation, even though they lost the election earlier in the season. This aspect of them being honest with their readers is also the main reason they have readers. It's not the numbers they give the girls or the places they visit that matter, but it's their overall opinion on said place that matters. Even when the reviewers were giving extremely different ratings among themselves, what mattered more was the fact that they all gave a different perspective on why they might feel that way, providing the readers with full pros and cons of a place. The show also highlights the thought process of people who get upset about reviewers just doing their job by using a character that revisits all the places that reviewers gave a low score to and gave them all 10 out of 10s, completely missing the reason as to why the reviewers gave their scores to begin with. Each reviewer has their different tastes, so obviously they're going to have a different experience at each place they visit, much like their readers will. Note, they don't villainize him for thinking every place he went to was a 10 out of 10. Rather, the show goes to state that if you give a 10 out of 10 and genuinely mean that, then your opinion is not going to be that helpful to people trying to find something they're specifically looking for. All the while, these messages of how people can get upset just because they disagree with an opinion, or how people can be so easily influenced by people who are famous, is conveyed to the viewer by sex reviewing suck girls. Hell, they even show the philosophy of an e-girl.
要するにあれか、ここのやつらは小遣い稼ぎに卵を産みに来るジョーを待ってる感じか。
そういうこと。だからガチの酒場以外に一般人もよく来るぞ。
なるほど。使用済みパンツを売りに来る小娘みたいなもんだな。
The way the show reflects our society is quite scary to think about. Like, look how upset people can get if you don't like their favorite anime. Or look at Taylor Swift. She is known for her singing. Yet, the off chance she goes to make a political comment about something, a lot of her fans immediately flock to support that comment, just on the sheer fact that they like her music. You have political parties using people of influence to promote them through various memes. I think a recent US candidate asked a whole bunch of meme accounts on Instamammogram to make memes about them. It's a real thing political parties do. So the idea of trying to improve the Demon Party's image by having a bunch of sex reviewers vouch for them is not too far off. Maybe throwing a slight jab at politicians at the same time. I'll cover more of why this is, as well as why this type of influence is slowly losing its relevance in depth in a different video, but for now I'll just leave it at this.
悪魔族が種族レベルで契約守るのが好きってことが世間に広まれば、公約演説に耳を傾けるきっかけになるかもしれないし、党にとってはメリットしかないってこと。
なるほどね。
自分から悪魔はこういう性質だって訴えてもうっさくさいしね。
エロレビューみたいな低俗な方向性から伝える方が確かに信憑性が高いよな。
Now we get into the main purpose of this video, how this anime stands triumph and is the pinnacle of what subversive parody should be. I'm going to start by defending myself and saying this. I use Konosuba a lot for comparisons because I think it's a standard. Konosuba is a really good anime, with great writing, characters, everything. So I use it as a baseline since anything below it is not going to be that good. But being on the same level as Konosuba already shows that the anime in question is already a high quality production. So being better than Konosuba must mean it's pretty fucking good. That being said, this blows Konosuba out the water in the previously mentioned aspects of satire and parody, but mainly in Subversion. To explain why Ishizoku reviewers work so well, I should explain why Konosuba doesn't quite hit the mark. Let's look at Konosuba. It's always been regarded as a fresh take of the isekai fantasy genre, rightfully so, but it's also regarded as very subversive since it takes a spin on the righteous hero and party trying to save the world by making the characters insufferable to the people around them. Let's run with that. In the first episode of Konosuba, we get the main setup for the rest of the story. We see Kazuma think he sacrifices himself to save the girl from the truck, but actually was a tractor and dies of a heart attack. Subversive. He meets with a goddess and she makes fun of him for how he dies. Subversive. Out of spite, Kazuma drags her into the other world with him. Subversive. They're poor. Subversive. They're underpowered. Subversive. They meet a lowly terrorist and a hot masochist. Subversive. Okay, you get the point, it's pretty subversive. They do different things compared to other animes, but does it actually? If we look at it from a storytelling perspective, all it is just another generic isekai story. A hero gets summoned from another world, meets a goddess, goes to a new world, meets with a party, goes to take down a demon king. It's still very much the exact same concept. It's subversive in how they go about it, but in the end, there's nothing subversive about the actual story. Konosuba is basically the Deadpool of isekais. Let's look at the Deadpool movie. It subverts the superhero formula by making Deadpool not your typical hero. You know, he's crude, he breaks the fourth wall, he hooks up with your not typical fair maiden. But the movie itself is still an origin story with nothing different about it. He tells his tragic past, he gets his powers, bad guy kidnaps love interest, he fights bad guy in big climactic battle, he gets the girl, happily ever after. Under all the humor and subversive characters, it's still just another superhero origin story. Same for Konosuba. Under all the, don't get me wrong, really well written and subversive characters, it's just another isekai fantasy story. To start off with, what sets Ishizoku reviewers apart is its world building. It's not like your simple cathedral world. Konosuba does a lot in explaining the adventurous side of things, like leveling up and such, but so far, in its anime at least, it leaves much to be desired. Ishizoku reviewers, in about a minute 30, establishes the entire basis of the world. It's actually impressive how it's able to establish the environment of the Suki girls and the different species that inhabit the world pretty well. It would only fall short if that was the only sense of world building you get throughout the show, but it expands on this simple idea as the show progresses. I mentioned earlier that there are places for non-fire resistant species to go in the volcano lands. Little details like this are scattered around the setting that we get each episode. They literally have a whole episode explaining periods.
いいか有力人の女の子の日はパンティー下ろして股を開いてぶっとい無精卵を切り出してんだぞポーンってな
It's easy to say that the details they give about the people living in the world are a little too specific. Even the relations some species might have with others is also brought up, as it would be strange for a species of birds to be fond of snakes, since they're natural predator and prey. But it's these little details that make the world feel more alive and realistic, despite some of the oddities it might have. Besides its world building being subversive in the sense that it actually exists, there are some things that you normally wouldn't care about. They cover the different political parties of the various species in the show. That does a lot for world building, but who actually cares? Well, the characters fucking don't. They just want to vote for the succubus party, since they have 5 rules. Nothing, also nothing, and wanna vote suck. This happens so much where they would build up different aspects of the world, but don't actually focus on them because they have little relation to the actual characters. They didn't go into the demon joint just to help out the demon party, they did it because they needed to get a review done and just happened to forget to do it earlier. Still expanding the world while keeping it relevant to the main character's goals and ideas. Speaking of those characters, I also mentioned that we learn aspects about their past, but never actually go into detail. Isn't it frustrating though, only being teased interesting things, but never actually getting more information on them? It would be if the show didn't act like One Punch Man in that aspect. In One Punch Man, since Saitama gets so annoyed by having to hear Genos' long backstory to the point where he tells him to say it in 20 words or less, it subverts the idea of a hero origin story by limiting it to maybe a little more than a sentence. The same applies here. You hear of this mysterious past of Stunk and his relationship with his father and hometown, but he says fuck off and it's not that very cool every time Zell tries to explain all of it. only really getting a reference to it at the end of the credits of the final episode, where Stunk and Zell take off to go to Stunk's father's harem. Or when it comes to Krim wanting to get back to heaven, this would normally entail a whole adventure to find something or defeat someone to get back to heaven, but Krim just acts indifferent about trying anything and expects the Halo to heal back on its own, not really putting in any effort and going down a hero's journey to fix it. One of my favorite parts about the whole world they live in is the fact that it is an isekai world, and our reviewers go on crazy adventures. We just never see them, which is actually really funny. At some point during the show, Stunk, Zell, and another reviewer save the world, but it's different from why Kazuma and his gang might be saving the world. In Konosuba, they're fighting a demon king to get Aqua back to her realm, but also to prevent the destruction of the world they were summoned to. Meanwhile, the reviewers only saved the world because they were out of sex money. And they didn't even know they saved the world. The show perfectly embodies the bait and switch aspect of the Subversive title. They set up many things that could possibly happen, but switch at the perfect moment so you get the joke, but also not feel like you're missing something. They set up a possibility of a villain trying to steal Krim's halo and use Krim's meat water as a way to better the equipment they have, but hit you with a, yeah, but that's illegal, I can't steal stuff.
あれからは私たちでは作り得ない神の属性を感じるわ。あれ欲しいな。めちゃくちゃ欲しい。いや、でもお客の体の一部を取っちゃダメでしょ。当然でしょ、そんなことは。
Instead of boring you with just a different rendition of a fantasy story, it instead focuses on aspects you don't often see. I keep bringing up all the things the show teases but doesn't actually show, such as Stunk and Zell's adventures, Krim in heaven, so on and so forth. But that doesn't make something on its own subversive. The reason why I emphasize these things is because it proves that these aspects of the world exist, but from the very start it subverts all expectations and the formula laid out by the other fantasy stories by having it never be the focus. In other anime, you don't see the different aspects of different species of a isekai fantasy world would interact besides elf don't like dwarf. You don't see what adventurers do in their free time, or if they're not on an adventure. So instead of focusing on them actually adventuring, the show is primarily showing what they do in their off time. They take what would be the most boring part of a fantasy setting, i.e. the not adventuring part, and make it more fun and exciting than it would be if you were to watch them go on an actual adventure. Now, some of my own personal thoughts on the show. This was honestly one of the most entertaining things I've ever watched, easily top 3 or 5 for me, to the point where, after watching this show, I almost immediately bought the first 3 volumes, and it didn't occur to me till about a week later when I opened up the package and saw that the manga was wrapped in plastic when I realized that I just bought a f***ing hentai. When you get lost in the isekai sauce, you can easily get tired of the same story, served in a slightly different way, but to have a show come in and flip the entire formula on its head is not only refreshing, but also just funny. The characters are easily what makes the show. The way I knew that these characters were fully fleshed out was the fact that me and Stunk thought the same. Let me preference this. As a human male, there are some things that are better than others. So even if a 400-year-old elf is like a grandma, she don't look like a grandma, and that's good enough for us. I really was able to relate to the characters in some sense. Stunk, you know, we're human males, so we got that bond going on. Krim, it was just hilarious seeing them sink into degeneracy, and reminds me of when I first got into Love Live, and then just sunk further and further to idle hell. But also acting as a straight man to Stunk and Zell's antics, because, let's be honest, going to a brothel and getting laid has gotta be at least a tad bit embarrassing. Also, the voice actor for Krim is the same one for Gabriel from Gabriel Dropout, and that's honestly just really funny to me that it's not her first time voicing a fallen angel. And then Zell was just fucking cool. Like, he's honestly such a funny-ass character. This scene alone will better explain why I feel this way. It's hard for me to explain why I love these characters so much, but they're just so fun to watch bounce off of each other, and I do think the voice acting really helped add to that aspect. Something else is just the background designs themselves. There's all this talk about world building, but if the actual backgrounds are boring and bland to look at, it can really make the show feel bland. Large empty green fields like the Windows 7 computer can have all the world building at once, but it's still boring. Just looking at the show is amazing. You have these beautiful neon lights in the background in the red light districts of the town, a hot red glow in the volcano lands. Each place has its own atmosphere and is unique to itself. I mean, the whole show is unique to itself, and it's a shame that it got caught up in so much controversy over pretty much nothing. Not too many people are looking at the show as the subversive masterpiece it is, but more of just it's that show, which is a shame since it's really just a fun show to watch. My roommates chose a bad time to come back since every time I heard that intro, you already know I was singing along. I think in the spirit of the show, we need to rate it. I don't have any other reviewers with me, but you immediately start off with an amazing narrator telling you a little bit about the world, and then get straight to business. If you came in expecting another isekai fantasy, you're going to be pleasantly surprised. It wasn't even kind enough to answer questions about the world I didn't even know I had. It entertains you in a strikingly fresh and subversive way, to the point where I would give it a perfect score even without all the dirty stuff. But, of course, there's that too. Because, holy shit dude, titties. Jude 10.
さあみんな一緒にスケベが大好き行こう元気出して行こうそうだろうエロいこと好きならば種族超えた仲間さ気持ちよくなりたい
If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, then please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more of stuff like this. I wouldn't usually ask this, but I already have a feeling that this is going to be a little bit more difficult to be approved by YouTube. So if you could maybe share it, that would be very much appreciated. That aside, the show was also enjoyable because when I was watching it, there was always this guy in the comments giving the full review that the reviewers wrote since they had to shorten some of them in the show, and this has nothing to do with anything, but I just wanted to say thank you. You're a real one for doing that. Overall, just such an amazing show. Genuinely really loved it, not even memeing. These characters are fucking awesome. They also uploaded the full uncensored version of certain scenes on the spicier websites. Wink wink. So if you haven't already, watch the anime, read the manga. I'll see you in the next one.